A boarding pass is supposed to be simple, a ticket to adventure, a promise of safe passage. But what happens when that promise is shattered? What happens when a couple who has spent their lives building success, respect, and dignity is suddenly told, at the gate of a luxury flight, that they don't belong? Dr. Nathaniel Carter, one of the nation's leading neurosurgeons, and his wife Amelia, a brilliant entrepreneur, were on their way to celebrate 20 years of marriage. Their dream, a first-class journey to Florence, Italy. Their reality, a humiliating confrontation at Los Angeles International Airport that would expose prejudice, shatter illusions, and ignite a storm across the world. Would they bow their heads and accept the insult, or would fate intervene in a way no one could have predicted? A pilot with a life-changing debt to repay. A viral video that shocked millions, and the downfall of a woman blinded by her own prejudice, all colliding at 30,000 feet. This is more than a travel story. It's a mirror held up to society. So before we dive in, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful true stories. The cabin lights of Aero Global Flight 716 glowed in a soft amber warmth, casting a gentle radiance over the first-class cabin. Dr. Nathaniel Carter settled into seat 2A with a slow exhale, his long frame adjusting into the leather cocoon that smelled faintly of cedar and polish. He tugged once at the cuff of his navy blazer, not out of vanity, but habit. The same steady hands that had navigated countless neurosurgeries now resting calmly on the armrest. Beside him, in 2B. Amelia Carter crossed her legs and leaned back against the headrest with a satisfied sigh. Her silk scarf caught a glimmer of the overhead light, the pale lavender color framing her face like the final touch on one of her own design projects. The two of them had waited 2 decades for this exact moment. For most passengers, a boarding pass was nothing more than a ticket, a rectangle of paper or pixels guaranteeing a seat from one city to another. For Nathaniel and Amelia, it was something far more symbolic. These 2 first-class seats were not just access to a cabin, they were a statement, a reward for 20 years of shared battles, of victories large and small. They were a celebration of endurance. The jet engines hummed faintly outside. A steady vibration felt more than heard. Amelia turned her face toward the oval window where Los Angeles glowed below, its lights a sprawling constellation stretching to the horizon. The city was behind them now, with its noise and pressure, with deadlines and obligations. Ahead lay Florence, a city of art, food, and romance. 2 weeks of freedom. 2 weeks of remembering what it felt like to simply be Nathaniel and Amelia. Not Dr. Carter the surgeon. Not Mrs. Carter the CEO, but husband and wife, celebrating 20 years of promises kept. Nathaniel reached across the console and laced his fingers with hers. His touch was gentle, reassuring. Amelia smiled without looking away from the lights outside. "Can you believe it?" she whispered. Her voice carried the softness of someone who had dreamed of this escape for years. He tilted his head, studying her profile. The strong curve of her jaw, the way her eyes still held that spark of determination, the same one he had first noticed when she defended a senior project presentation in college. "I believe it," he said, his voice low but firm. "You deserve Florence. You deserve every museum, every glass of wine, every sunrise on the Arno. And you deserve me sitting right there beside you for every second of it." She laughed quietly, that warm laugh that always reached her eyes. "Every second, even the jet lag." "Especially the jet lag," he said. For a moment, the first-class cabin melted away. They weren't professionals with reputations or a black couple navigating spaces that often doubted their belonging. They were just Nathaniel and Amelia, the 20-year promise that still held. A flight attendant glided by, offering sparkling water in crystal glasses. Amelia accepted one, Nathaniel another. The fizz rose in delicate threads, catching the light. The small luxury made Amelia's chest swell with quiet pride. They had earned this. Every long night at the hospital, every grueling client negotiation, every barrier they had to push through, twice as hard just to be seen as equal. This seat, this flight, this trip, it was theirs. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly, exhaustion creeping in. He had spent the morning in surgery, an 8-hour operation to remove a tumor near a young boy's brainstem. The kind of procedure that drained him physically, but also reaffirmed his purpose. Lives reclaimed. Futures returned, that was his calling. He had showered at the hospital, exchanged scrubs for a tailored blazer, and walked straight into this chapter with Amelia. She, in turn, had just wrapped the unveiling of a penthouse interior project in Beverly Hills, her company's latest triumph. They had met at the terminal like two halves of a plan, years in the making, both tired but exhilarated. "You remember our honeymoon?" he asked suddenly, opening one eye to glance at her. "How could I forget?" Amelia chuckled. "That motel in Key Largo with the broken air conditioner and the suspiciously damp carpet and that rental car that rattled like a washing machine every time we hit 40. She shook her head, smiling wide now. "We thought we were living in luxury back then." "We were," Nathaniel replied simply. "Because I was with you." The words hung between them, tender and absolute. Amelia squeezed his hand once more. All around, the first-class cabin carried on in a muted symphony. A businessman scrolled through spreadsheets on a glowing laptop. A young couple clinked champagne flutes in a quiet toast. A mother hummed softly to a toddler balanced on her lap. It was peaceful, almost serene. Yet somewhere in Nathaniel's chest, a small knot of caution remained. Experience had taught him that peace for people like them was often conditional, fragile. They had learned to brace for the moments when someone's doubt or bias could turn the simplest encounter into a test of composure. He didn't voice it. He didn't want to disturb the perfection of the moment, but Amelia sensed it anyway, as she always did. "You're thinking again," she murmured, her head tilting slightly. "Always," he admitted. "But tonight, I'm trying not to." "Try harder," she teased gently, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We're here. We made it. That's all that matters." He pressed his cheek against her hair, inhaling the faint perfume she wore, a floral note that had become the scent of home to him. He closed his eyes again, forcing himself to believe her. For now, there was only them, only Florence waiting across the Atlantic. The flight attendants prepared to close the doors. The captain's voice echoed softly through the speakers, welcoming passengers aboard Aeroglobal Flight 716. Nathaniel listened absently, not realizing that the man speaking would soon alter the course of their entire journey. The amber lights dimmed slightly, the cabin easing into night mode. Nathaniel and Amelia lifted their glasses in a quiet toast. "To 20 years, Amelia whispered. "To 20 more." Nathaniel answered, and as the plane began to push back from the gate, their journey, both the dream and the storm yet to come, was set into motion. The takeoff was smooth, the kind of ascent that made the city below shrink into a patchwork quilt of glowing orange and white. Nathaniel Carter felt the familiar tug of gravity press him into his seat. Then the sudden lightness as the Airbus leveled into its climb. The rumble softened into a steady drone. He glanced at Amelia, who had already slipped her shoes off, curling her toes against the footrest with a small sigh of comfort. She looked like she belonged here, poised, calm, radiant in the way only Amelia could be. He let himself believe, just for a moment, that the hardest part of their journey was behind them. But peace on airplanes is always provisional. The curtain at the front of the cabin parted with a swift movement, and in walked Sandra Whitmore. She was the kind of woman passengers noticed immediately: tall, sharp-shouldered, with a platinum bob cut that seemed sculpted into place. Her uniform was immaculate, pressed so crisply it almost shone. The faint smile on her lips was thin and mechanical, her eyes scanning the cabin with the brisk detachment of someone counting inventory rather than greeting human beings. Amelia noticed it first, the way Sandra stopped at each row of first class, offering polite words, a touch on the shoulder, even a joke for the older gentleman in 1C who chuckled too loudly. But when she reached row 2, the smile cooled, the warmth evaporated. Sandra's gaze swept over Nathaniel and Amelia like a scanner, up and down, pausing in a way that lingered too long. "Good evening," Sandra said, her voice clipped, her hand extended, palm open. "Boarding passes, please." Nathaniel blinked. "Boarding passes. We already scanned at the gate. I'll need to see them again," she replied. No smile now, no softness, just a rigid formality. Amelia glanced around the cabin. No one else was being asked. The couple across the aisle had reclined their seats, sipping champagne. The young man in 3A was already watching a movie. Not one of them had been stopped for a second inspection. Still, Nathaniel reached into the inside pocket of his blazer, pulled out the crisp passes, and handed them over. His hand was steady. Years of practice made it so. He had held steady in operating rooms filled with chaos, with alarms blaring, with the weight of lives on his shoulders. He could hold steady here. Sandra took the passes with 2 fingers, as though they might soil her hand. Her eyes flicked from the names to their faces, then back to the passes. "Carter," she said slowly, as though pronouncing it for the first time. She tapped the paper against her palm. "And your passports?" Nathaniel exchanged a quick glance with Amelia. He reached again into his bag, retrieved the 2 passports, and placed them carefully on her tray table. Sandra flipped them open with an audible snap. She studied the photographs, then looked up sharply, eyes narrowing, scanning every detail of their features as if trying to catch them in a lie. Behind them, a passenger coughed. The cabin, usually filled with quiet murmurs and the clink of glasses, seemed suddenly hushed, as though everyone was watching without daring to turn their heads. Amelia forced her voice into calm. "Is there a problem?" Sandra's eyes did not leave the passport. "Routine verification." "Routine?" Nathaniel asked, his voice low but firm. "Why is no one else being asked for this verification?" Sandra looked at him then, really looked, and for the briefest moment her mask cracked. Something colder flickered in her eyes. She closed the passports with a snap, set them on the tray, and leaned closer. "Sometimes," she said, voice pitched just low enough for them to hear but loud enough to carry if anyone strained. "Flags don't show up until mid-flight. Payment irregularities, security notes. You'd be surprised what comes through." The words were designed to sting, to make them feel suspect, illegitimate. Amelia placed her hand lightly on Nathaniel's arm. She had felt the subtle tightening of his muscles, the way his jaw had set. "It's fine," she murmured, though the words were for him more than for her. Sandra straightened, her expression once again a blank mask of professional efficiency. "I'll need to confirm this with the system," she announced. She pivoted sharply on her heel, carrying the passes and passports with her. Nathaniel felt his throat tighten. The instinct to rise, to follow, to demand their documents back, pulsed hot in his chest, but Amelia's fingers pressed down gently, anchoring him to his seat. "Not yet," she whispered. He closed his eyes for a beat. Not yet. Minutes dragged like hours. The champagne on the tray table went flat, untouched. Nathaniel tried to focus on his breath, the way he coached young residents in surgery to slow down, control the tempo, never let adrenaline dictate the incision. Amelia stared out the window, the soft line of her jaw betraying the tension in her body. She had spent a lifetime in boardrooms where her authority was questioned, her designs second-guessed. She knew the weight of condescension. She knew how to wait it out. When Sandra returned, she carried the documents between her fingers like evidence bags. She handed the passports back, wordlessly, but kept hold of the boarding passes. "There appears to be a discrepancy," she said in a louder voice now, one designed to carry to the rows around them. "The payment for these seats was flagged. We may need to reseat you further back in the aircraft until this is resolved." Amelia's breath caught. Her first impulse was laughter, sharp and incredulous. But the laughter never came. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her voice steady as glass. "That is absurd. These seats were purchased months ago on an American Express Platinum card. The payment cleared immediately. There is no discrepancy." Sandra tilted her head, a smile curving faintly at the corners of her mouth. "The system says otherwise." Nathaniel drew in a breath, held it, and released it carefully. He looked directly into Sandra's eyes. "Then, call your supervisor." Sandra's smile thinned. "I was about to—" She turned and walked briskly toward the galley, the boarding passes still in her grip. Around them, the quiet murmur of passengers resumed, but now tinged with an edge of unease. A man in 3C leaned forward to catch a glimpse, his brows furrowed. The couple across the aisle shifted uncomfortably. A young man in 4D angled his phone subtly toward the scene, thumb hovering over the screen. Amelia closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself. Her hand still rested on Nathaniel's arm. She felt the heat in him, the simmering restraint. "We've trained for this," she whispered, barely audible. He nodded once. They had. 20 years of living in spaces where suspicion clung to them like shadows had taught them the rules. Do not raise your voice. Do not show anger. Be unshakably polite. Never give them the out they're looking for. But even as he nodded, Nathaniel felt the battle beginning inside him. Because there were moments when dignity felt indistinguishable from silence, moments when patience felt like surrender. And he was not sure how much longer he could surrender before something inside him broke. The hum of the engines was steady, but inside row 2, the tension vibrated like a taut string. Nathaniel Carter kept his gaze fixed on the aisle where Sandra had disappeared. Amelia's hand still rested lightly on his arm, the warmth of her touch the only thing keeping him from rising and marching straight to the galley. He could feel the stares now subtle, sidelong glances from fellow passengers who had noticed the disruption. Some looked curious, others impatient, and a few carried the unmistakable edge of judgment. Minutes later, Sandra returned, this time not alone. Behind her walked a man in his early 50s, tall but slightly stooped, his navy blazer marked by the airline's silver supervisor pin. His thinning hair clung stubbornly to his scalp, and the way he rubbed the back of his neck suggested he had been pulled into conflicts like this one before. He carried the air of someone tired of problems but unwilling to challenge the employees who caused them. "This is Mr. Blake, our flight supervisor," Sandra announced, her voice pitched to carry through the cabin. "He will address this situation." Nathaniel rose slowly from his seat, his height and calm posture commanding attention. He didn't want to stand, But there was something humiliating about sitting while your legitimacy was questioned aloud. He looked at Blake directly, his tone measured but resolute. Our seats were purchased months ago. Full fare. First class. We've already checked in, passed security, scanned at the gate. There is no issue. Yet your lead attendant has suggested otherwise. Blake's expression flickered. A brief calculation. He looked at Nathaniel, then at Amelia, then at Sandra, who stood just behind him with folded arms and a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "Sir," Blake said finally, "I understand your frustration, but our system shows a payment flag. Until that is cleared, we cannot allow you to remain in first class. For now, the most we can do is reseat you in economy until this discrepancy is resolved." The words landed like stones. A hush fell over the cabin. Even the toddler 2 rows up seemed to fall silent. Amelia leaned forward, her voice clear, precise, every syllable ringing with controlled outrage. "You're telling us that despite valid documentation, despite confirmation emails and receipts, despite scanning through 2 checkpoints already, your solution is to strip us of the seats we purchased and push us to the back of the plane." Blake's eyes darted briefly to the other passengers, then back. "It's procedure," he muttered. "Procedure." The word stung more than an outright insult. Nathaniel inhaled sharply through his nose. In operating rooms, procedure was sacred. It meant order, safety, a lifeline. But here, the word had been twisted into a shield for bias, a justification for humiliation. "Let me see the flag," Amelia pressed, her voice cutting like glass. "Show me the discrepancy." "I'm not authorized to display internal systems," Blake answered quickly, his hand tightening around the edge of his folder. "I assure you, this is standard." Nathaniel's composure trembled on a knife's edge. His entire career had been built on the discipline to hold steady under pressure. He had remained calm while blood vessels ruptured, while monitors screamed, while families prayed outside operating rooms, but standing in a cabin full of strangers, accused without evidence, treated as though he did not belong, it ignited something deeper, older, harder to contain. The thoughts swirled, sharp and conflicting. If he raised his voice, if he pushed back too forcefully, he knew what might happen. He had seen the headlines, "Disruptive passenger removed." He had heard the stories of men who looked like him, escorted off flights in handcuffs for doing less than what was happening to him now. Yet the alternative felt unbearable. To silently accept being cast out of the space he had rightfully earned was not dignity, it was surrender. And surrender would taste like ash. Amelia touched his hand under the console. Her palm was cool, steady. Her eyes met his, carrying the silent message they had exchanged for 20 years. Hold on. Stay steady. Not yet. But Sandra's voice cut through the fragile restraint. "Mr. Blake, the cabin is waiting. We can't delay the service any longer. If they refuse to move, I'll have to call security." Security. The word was a threat, and it was deliberate. Amelia felt the heat rise in her chest. She had endured skepticism in boardrooms, endured being underestimated, overlooked, and second-guessed. But this public stage, where their competence and honesty were questioned before an audience of strangers, this was something different. She lifted her chin, her voice unwavering. "We are not moving. We are not stepping aside. These are our seats. You will not relegate us to the back of this aircraft simply because your employee has decided we do not belong here." The cabin air seemed to thicken. Blake shifted uncomfortably. Sandra crossed her arms tighter, her smirk sharpening. A businessman in 1D muttered under his breath, clearly impatient. A woman 2 rows back frowned in sympathy. The tension hung heavy, pulling every pair of eyes toward row 2. Nathaniel spoke then, his tone low, commanding, the same tone he used when instructing surgical residents in moments of crisis. "Mr. Blake, call your captain right now. If you cannot resolve this, then let the captain of this aircraft make the final call. But understand this is not the end of the matter. If we are removed from these seats, Aero Global will hear from us directly and not through a complaint form, through lawyers." Blake's jaw tightened. His instinct was to de-escalate, but his loyalty to his staff, his reluctance to challenge Sandra, tethered him. He nodded stiffly. "I'll inform the captain," he said. He turned, gesturing for Sandra to follow. Together they disappeared into the galley. Nathaniel sat back down slowly, his hands clasped together, his knuckles white. Amelia exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She wanted to reach for him again, but she also knew he needed the space to wrestle with the storm inside. Across the aisle, a young man lowered his phone slightly, his face pale but intent. Ethan Morales, freelance journalist, had been watching the entire exchange. His thumb hovered over the record button, his instincts screaming. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then tapped. The red light blinked to life. Through the lens, he captured everything: the rigid posture of Sandra, the uneasy shifting of Blake, the dignified resolve etched into Nathaniel's features, the quiet fury in Amelia's eyes. He knew immediately this wasn't just an isolated conflict. This was a story, one that demanded to be told. Nathaniel leaned back against the headrest, closing his eyes for a brief moment. Inside him, a war raged. Every lesson of restraint, every reminder to stay calm, collided with the raw ache of humiliation. The words of every mentor, every warning from his father about how the world would see him first and judge him later, echoed in his mind. "Breathe," Amelia whispered. He opened his eyes and met hers. She was his anchor, the reminder that they had survived worse. But the wound of this moment was fresh and deep, and he feared it would not heal easily. In the quiet that followed, the sound of the engines filled the space, steady and relentless. Nathaniel wondered how many more miles he could travel in silence before something inside him snapped. The air in the first-class cabin had shifted. What had begun as a sanctuary of hushed voices and clinking glasses now carried a static edge, a tension that pressed against the skin. Nathaniel Carter sat motionless, every muscle taut, while Amelia held herself with the poise of a queen forced to wait in someone else's court. Around them, the passengers pretended to focus on their movies or books, but their ears were tuned, their eyes flicking back toward row 2 with guilty curiosity. It did not take long for Sandra Whitmore to return. Her stride was brisk, her shoulders squared, her expression the triumphant mask of someone who believed she had won the day. Behind her, Supervisor Thomas Blake looked drained, as though caught between conflicting loyalties and desperate for this to end quietly. Sandra stopped at their row and placed the boarding passes down on the tray table with a sharp tap. "Dr. Carter, Mrs. Carter," she said in a tone that barely concealed disdain. "The captain has been informed, but until the issue is resolved, you will need to relocate to economy. I have arranged 2 seats together near the rear of the aircraft. We'll ensure you're comfortable." The phrasing was deliberate, almost mocking. Comfortable in the back of the plane, stripped of the seats they had paid for, stripped of their dignity in front of a watching crowd. Amelia's chest rose as she drew in a slow breath. "No," she said simply. Sandra's lips twitched. "Excuse me." Amelia straightened her shoulders. "We are not moving. These are our seats. We will not accept economy, and we will not be bullied into disappearing to the back of this plane." The calm steel in her voice carried through the cabin. Heads turned now, openly. Someone shifted uncomfortably, The young man with the phone, Ethan Morales, kept recording, his device angled just enough to catch both the Carters and the attendants. Sandra leaned forward, her voice dropping into a lower, sharper register. Mrs. Carter, refusing to comply with crew instructions can be considered grounds for removal. If I call airport security, this will become much more unpleasant for you. Nathaniel felt the words cut deep. He knew what removal meant. He pictured the stories he had read, the images of men who looked like him dragged down narrow aisles, handcuffed, smeared in headlines as threats rather than victims. His stomach tightened, his pulse beat in his temples, yet he also heard Amelia's words echoing, steady, immovable. We are not moving. He rose from his seat again, slowly, deliberately. At his full height, his presence filled the narrow aisle, his voice low but carrying. You've humiliated us enough. You've questioned our legitimacy without cause. If you believe you can strip us of these seats, then do it in front of every passenger here. But know this: when this flight lands, Aero Global will face consequences, legal, financial, and moral, and you will be the face of it. The cabin was silent. Even the businessman in 1D, who had been muttering earlier, now sat frozen, caught in the gravity of Nathaniel's words. Thomas Blake cleared his throat, stepping in as though to mediate. Sir, please, we don't want this to escalate. Let's just find a reasonable compromise. Nathaniel turned on him, his tone sharpened but still under control. A compromise implies both sides have erred. Tell me, Mr. Blake, what have we done wrong? We paid. We checked in. We followed every rule. The only thing we've done is take our seats while being black in first class. And for that, you offer us exile to economy. That is not a compromise. That is capitulation to prejudice. Blake's mouth opened and closed, no answer forming. His face flushed crimson, the weight of every watching eye pressing down. Sandra, sensing her authority slipping, tried again. I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft. My responsibility is to ensure safety and order. If you defy my instructions, safety, Nathaniel cut in, his voice rising now, though still measured. How exactly does our presence in seats we purchased endanger safety, or is the danger only to your sense of order? The words sliced through the cabin like a scalpel. Several passengers shifted, murmurs rippling now. The line between observer and witness was being crossed. Ethan zoomed his camera closer, the red recording light blinking steadily. Amelia placed a hand on Nathaniel's arm again, not to silence him, but to tether him, to keep his fury balanced with dignity. Her own voice carried forward, softer, but no less commanding. We have raised children. We have built businesses. We have saved lives. And yet, here we are, having to prove yet again that we deserve to sit where we belong. Do you understand the exhaustion of that? Ms. Whitmore Sandra's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then came a new sound, the click of the cockpit door opening. Every head turned as Captain Daniel Reeves stepped into the galley, his presence immediately altering the atmosphere. His uniform carried authority like armor, the gold stripes on his shoulders catching the overhead light. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face calm but serious. He scanned the cabin, his gaze narrowing as it landed on the standoff in row 2. What seems to be the problem here? His voice was calm, but carried the weight of final authority. Sandra straightened, her tone suddenly more deferential. Captain Reeves, thank you. We have a situation with these 2 passengers. Their payment has been flagged, and I was relocating them to economy until it's cleared. Reeves looked at her, then at Blake, then at the Carters. He took in Nathaniel's height, Amelia's composed fury, the hush of the watching cabin. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition not yet spoken. Flagged payment, Reeves repeated, his tone skeptical. On a first-class ticket, already cleared through 2 checkpoints. Yes, Captain, Sandra insisted. It's a protocol issue. I can't allow them to remain. Reeves lifted a hand, silencing her. His gaze fixed now on Nathaniel, his brow furrowing as if trying to place a memory. Dr. Carter, he asked slowly. Nathaniel blinked, caught off guard. Yes, Reeves stepped closer, his voice carrying not just authority now, but something else, emotion. Daniel Reeves, my wife, 3 years ago. UCLA Medical. You don't remember me, do you? The name struck Nathaniel like a jolt. He searched his memory, then it hit Rebecca Reeves. A complex aneurysm case, surgery that lasted nearly 15 hours. He remembered the anxious husband pacing the hospital hallway, the tears that had flowed when he delivered the news that she would recover. Captain Reeves, Nathaniel said quietly. Your wife. She survived. She thrives, Reeves replied, his voice thick with gratitude. She's alive because of you. My children have their mother because of you. The cabin seemed to lean in closer, every passenger suddenly aware they were witnessing a revelation. Sandra paled. Blake swallowed hard. Reeves turned sharply toward Sandra, his expression now icy. And you were about to throw Dr. Carter and his wife into economy. On my aircraft, Sandra stammered, her lips trembling. Captain, I was only following procedure. Reeves cut her off, his tone razor-sharp. Procedure is what you hide behind when you've lost sight of judgment and decency. What you did wasn't procedure, it was prejudice, and I will not allow it on my plane. The words thundered through the cabin. The silence that followed was electric, heavy with both shame and relief. Amelia felt a rush of vindication surge through her, but it was tempered by exhaustion. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly, gratitude and weariness mingling. They had been seen, finally, by someone whose authority outweighed Sandra's cruelty. Captain Reeves stepped closer to them. His expression softened as he spoke directly to Nathaniel. On this flight, Dr. Carter, you are my guest of honor. As far as I'm concerned, you're my boss. The passengers gasped quietly, the declaration echoing with finality. Ethan's camera captured it all, the twist that would soon travel far beyond the confines of Aero Global Flight 716. The silence inside the first-class cabin was so complete that even the low hum of the engines felt distant, like a background murmur to something larger unfolding. Captain Daniel Reeves stood in the aisle, the gold stripes on his shoulders gleaming under the cabin lights. His gaze remained fixed on Sandra Whitmore, who looked smaller now, her earlier smugness drained into something close to panic. Captain, she began again, her voice wavering. I assure you, I was following protocol. Reeves lifted a hand, firm and dismissive. Enough. Protocol doesn't strip passengers of their dignity. Protocol doesn't allow you to accuse a man and his wife of fraud without evidence. What you did was not protocol. It was a choice. A wrong one. His words cracked through the tension like a whip. Thomas Blake, standing just behind Sandra, shifted uncomfortably. His collar seemed too tight, his forehead damp. He had thrown his weight behind her earlier, confident that siding with his lead attendant was the safer path. Now, under the captain's glare, he felt the sting of exposure. Mr. Blake, Reeves said, his tone like steel, you're the supervisor here. Did you authorize this humiliation? Blake's mouth opened, then shut. He fumbled for words. I trusted Ms. Whitmore's judgment. Captain, she said there was a system flag, Reeves repeated, disbelief thick in his voice. I'll tell you what I see flagged. I see judgment clouded by bias. I see two paying passengers treated like intruders because someone decided they didn't belong here. That is what I see flagged. Every eye in the cabin was fixed on him now. The businessman in 1D, who had been restless earlier, no longer looked annoyed. He looked chastened. The older woman in pearls clutched her handbag tighter. Her lips pursed. The couple across the aisle exchanged uneasy glances. And Ethan Morales, phone steady in his hands, captured it all. Sandra's face had gone pale. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. Reeves turned back to Nathaniel and Amelia, his expression softening. Dr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, I want to apologize. On behalf of Aero Global, and personally, I am sorry. What you endured here should never have happened. Amelia inclined her head, her voice quiet but resolute. Thank you, Captain, but apologies don't erase the fact that it did happen. Reeves nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. No, they don't, but they can be the start of accountability. He pivoted back toward Sandra, his voice dropping into a dangerous calm. You will return their boarding passes immediately. You will not address these passengers again for the remainder of this flight. Do I make myself clear? Sandra's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She nodded once, quickly, before fumbling in her folder and producing the passes. Her hand trembled as she set them down on Nathaniel's tray table. Now step aside, Reeves commanded. She obeyed, retreating down the aisle toward the galley. Passengers tracked her movements, their eyes like spotlights. For Sandra, the aisle became a gauntlet, her authority stripped away with every step. Blake lingered, shifting awkwardly. Reeves turned his gaze on him. Supervisor Blake, your conduct will be addressed with management. You had a choice to de-escalate, to question, to lead. Instead, you chose expedience and allowed this humiliation to play out. That failure will not be ignored. Blake's face burned crimson. He mumbled something inaudible and backed away toward the galley, desperate to escape the scrutiny. With the antagonist gone, a different kind of silence filled the cabin, not one of hostility, but of collective reckoning. Every passenger seemed to understand that something profound had just occurred, that they had witnessed both cruelty and courage, prejudice and justice, all within the narrow walls of a plane. Reeves crouched slightly so he was level with the Carters. His voice softened, carrying only to them. Dr. Carter, you don't remember, but when my wife came out of that surgery, I told myself that if I ever had the chance to repay you, I would. I didn't expect it to be here, on this plane. But I'll be damned if I let anyone treat you like you don't belong. Nathaniel's throat tightened. His eyes flicked briefly to Amelia's before returning to the captain. Captain Reeves, I was doing my job. Saving lives is my duty. What you did just now, that was more than duty. That was decency. Reeves shook his head. Decency should be the baseline. What you and your wife endured here shows we still have a long way to go. Amelia felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to say something sharp, something reflective, but all that came out was a quiet, heartfelt, "Thank you." Reeves nodded once more, then straightened, his voice loud enough for the entire cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Nathaniel Carter and his wife Amelia will remain in the seats they purchased. They are valued passengers. If I hear of any further disrespect directed toward them, it will be dealt with swiftly. Do I make myself clear? The words hung in the air. No one dared to respond, but the shift was palpable. Passengers who had looked on with suspicion now looked away in shame. A few glanced at the Carters with tentative smiles of solidarity. Ethan's recording captured it all: the captain's firm declaration, the ripple of discomfort among the guilty, the quiet vindication in the Carter's posture. He knew the footage was gold, but even more, he knew it was truth, the kind of truth that demanded to be shared. Nathaniel eased back into his seat, his body still tense, but his spirit lighter. Amelia reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. They didn't need words in that moment. The grip itself was enough a reminder that they had endured together, as they always had. As the cabin slowly returned to motion, flight attendants resuming service, passengers lowering screens, Reeves lingered a moment longer. He looked down the aisle where Sandra had disappeared, his jaw set. Then he returned to the cockpit, the authority of the aircraft restored not by procedure, but by principle. Amelia leaned closer to Nathaniel, her voice low. "Do you feel vindicated?" He exhaled slowly, staring at the untouched glass of champagne still on the tray. "I feel seen, but vindication." He shook his head. Vindication would be a system that didn't need a miracle coincidence to protect us. Amelia pressed her lips together, nodding. She understood too well. The injustice wasn't erased because one man had chosen to intervene. It was only exposed behind them. Ethan ended the recording, his heart racing. He replayed a few seconds, the captain's words sharp and undeniable. He already knew the headline, "Pilot Defends Black Couple." Calls Doctor Who saved his wife. His boss. The story was going to explode, but as he looked at the Carters, he realized the real power wasn't in the twist. It was in the dignity they carried through humiliation, the restraint that had made the captain's defense possible. The seatbelt sign chimed overhead, a reminder that they were still just passengers hurtling through the night sky at 35,000 feet. But in row 2, the air was charged with something more: relief, exhaustion, and the faint, flickering glow of justice. Nathaniel leaned back, eyes closing briefly. Amelia's hand still clasped in his. He knew the flight wasn't over, not the one to Florence, and not the larger journey they were on. This was only the beginning of a storm that would follow them far beyond this plane. The clink of ice in crystal glasses and the muted shuffle of attendants resuming service returned the cabin to its routine. But the atmosphere in row 2 lingered heavy with what had just unfolded. Nathaniel Carter leaned back in his seat, his posture composed, but his body still vibrating with the echo of adrenaline. Amelia's hand remained entwined with his, her thumb tracing steady, grounding circles against his knuckles. On the surface, the crisis seemed resolved. Their boarding passes lay firmly on the tray table, undeniable proof of their right to sit where they were. Sandra Whitmore had been banished to the galley, her authority reduced to silence. Supervisor Blake had retreated with her, his shoulders hunched under the captain's rebuke. Justice, at least in this narrow cabin, had been served, but Nathaniel's mind would not rest. Even as a flight attendant appeared with flutes of champagne, Dom Perignon. Chilled to perfection, he felt the bitterness rise in his throat. The glass sat untouched. He turned slightly toward Amelia, his voice low. If Reeves hadn't known me, if it hadn't been his wife 3 years ago. He trailed off, the unfinished sentence heavier than any conclusion. Amelia understood. She tilted her head, her dark eyes reflecting both tenderness and frustration. "We'd be in row 37 right now, next to the lavatory, pretending to sleep while a child kicks the back of our seats." The faintest smile touched Nathaniel's lips, but it vanished quickly. Exactly. We were saved by chance, not by policy, not by justice, by coincidence? Amelia sighed, resting her head briefly against his shoulder. Coincidence may have spared us tonight, but it doesn't change the truth of what happened. And truth has a way of finding daylight. A few rows behind them, Ethan Morales adjusted in his seat, his phone warm in his hand. The video file he had captured replayed in miniature Sandra's clip tone, Blake's wavering defense, Nathaniel's calm defiance, Amelia's razor-sharp retort, and finally, Captain Reeves standing tall, calling the doctor who had saved his wife his boss. Ethan's journalistic instincts thrummed with urgency. He had recorded confrontations before, but this one was different. It wasn't just conflict, it was story. It was prejudice laid bare, dignity tested, and a twist that no screenwriter could have scripted better. He added captions, cleaned the audio, and cued the file for upload. His fingers hesitated just before tapping post. He looked up, his eyes landing on the Carters. Nathaniel's head was tilted back, eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with deliberate calm. Amelia sat upright, poised, her hand still anchored in her husband's. They hadn't seen him recording. They hadn't given consent. Ethan wrestled with it. Would posting be another violation, another intrusion into a moment that should belong to them? But then he remembered Sandra's voice, sharp and loud enough for the whole cabin. If they refuse to move, I'll have to call security. He remembered the smirks, the condescension, the humiliation pressed against their skin like a public brand. This wasn't just their story anymore. It was everyone's who had ever been told they didn't belong. Ethan hit post. The video uploaded, carried into the current of social media with the force of a tide. Within minutes, the first retweets appeared, then dozens, then hundreds. Ethan tagged major outlets, influencers, journalists he knew. By the time the plane was somewhere over the Rockies, the story had already begun its viral climb. Back in row 2, Amelia reached for the champagne at last. She sipped, the bubbles crisp against her tongue, but it didn't wash away the bitterness. She leaned closer to Nathaniel. "What hurts most isn't her words," she said softly. "It's that I saw passengers believe her. The woman clutching her purse tighter. The man sighing like we were inconveniencing him. It wasn't just Sandra. It was the silent judgment from people who looked right through us." Nathaniel opened his eyes. The fatigue etched into their depths. I felt it too. The presumption. The calculation of whether we belonged. It's exhausting, Amelia, to fight for the right to sit in a seat we've already paid for. She rested her hand against his cheek. And yet you did. You always do. He turned his face slightly, pressing his lips against her palm, the gesture tender, weary, full of love and resignation. Across the cabin, whispers spread. A younger couple in 3A and 3B leaned together, murmuring about the scene they had just witnessed. The businessman in 1D shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Nathaniel with something close to guilt. Even the older woman in pearls looked contemplative now, her gaze softer, though she made no move to speak. The lead flight attendant approached, her posture stiff, her voice careful. "Dr. and Mrs. Carter, may I get you anything else? Dinner service will begin shortly." Nathaniel studied her, searching for any trace of Sandra's sneer in her face, but all he saw was sincerity, tinged with embarrassment. He inclined his head politely. "Water will be fine." She nodded quickly, retreating as though afraid to intrude further, for a moment. Nathaniel and Amelia sat in silence, each lost in thought. Vindication was theirs, but it felt hollow. The cabin had been forced to witness their humiliation and their defense, but not their private wound. That ache was theirs alone. Nathaniel's thoughts churned the years of being followed in stores, of being questioned at hospital entrances despite his badge, of being asked if he was really the doctor by families desperate for answers, and now, here in the sky, stripped bare before strangers, He clenched his jaw, the quiet fury simmering beneath his practiced calm. Amelia sensed it. "Don't let them take more from you," she whispered. "Not tonight. Not when we're supposed to be celebrating." He turned to her, his eyes glistening. "How many times do we have to swallow it? Amelia, how many times do we have to let it slide for the sake of peace?" Her lips trembled, but her voice was steady. "As many times as it takes until the world sees what we see in each other. Until people like Reeves stand up more often. Until silence becomes impossible." Nathaniel nodded slowly, her words sinking deep. Somewhere above Nebraska. Ethan refreshed his feed. The video had crossed 100,000 views. Comments poured in outrage, solidarity, disbelief. Strangers were already demanding Sandra's name, Aero Global's accountability, justice for the Carters. The tide had begun. In the cabin, unaware of the storm building online, Nathaniel finally reached for the champagne. He lifted the glass, meeting Amelia's eyes. "To us," he said softly. "To us," she echoed, clinking her glass against his. The toast was quiet, private, but it carried the weight of resilience, of 20 years of shared battles and victories. Vindication might feel fragile, but together they remained unbroken. And far below, in the digital currents of the world, they had not yet rejoined. Their story was already beginning to burn. Dinner in first class was served with precision, each dish presented like a work of art on porcelain plates. For most passengers, the ritual was a symbol of indulgence, a pleasant distraction from the monotony of hours in the sky. For Nathaniel and Amelia Carter, it felt like a strange performance layered over the residue of humiliation. Nathaniel toyed with his appetizer, a delicate arrangement of smoked salmon and crème fraîche. His appetite was gone, not from the food itself, but from the tight coil still wound inside him. He cut a bite, lifted it halfway, then set his fork down again. Amelia noticed she had barely touched her own plate. The lamb entree arrived soon after, aromatic and perfectly seared, yet it too sat mostly untouched. To any casual observer, they looked like a couple too preoccupied with conversation to eat. In truth, they were wrestling with thoughts too heavy for indulgence. Nathaniel broke the silence first, his voice low. "I keep replaying it." Her eyes when she looked at us, it wasn't just suspicion, Amelia. It was contempt, like she couldn't imagine we belonged here. Amelia's gaze lingered on the rim of her wine glass. It's the same look we've seen 100 times before. At restaurants, at hotels, at school meetings. The look that says, "Are you sure you're not lost?" His jaw flexed. And every time we swallow it, we smile. We explain ourselves. Tonight, for once, I wanted to do more than swallow. "You did," Amelia said firmly. She reached for his hand again, anchoring him. "You stood your ground, and you did it without becoming the stereotype they wanted you to be. That's power." Nathaniel's chest rose and fell, a measured breath. "Then why does it still feel like losing? Because dignity isn't supposed to be a prize you earn," she replied, her tone soft but sharp. "It's supposed to be the baseline." The words hung between them. Nathaniel leaned back, his eyes fixed on the low cabin lights. Around them, other passengers ate in silence. Some stole furtive glances, others deliberately avoided eye contact. The unspoken reality lingered. Everyone in that cabin had witnessed prejudice in motion. Some had been complicit in their silence. Amelia sipped her wine, her voice quieter now. "We'll carry this longer than they will. For them, it's an anecdote to share over cocktails. Did you see what happened on that flight to Florence? For us, it's another scar." Nathaniel looked at her, admiration mingling with sorrow. "And still you hold your head high." "It's the only way forward," she said simply. Across the ocean of clouds, far below. Ethan Morales' video was blazing. By now, it had been viewed over 500,000 times. Twitter was aflame with hashtags, Flying While Black, Aero Global, Captain Reeves. Influencers amplified it. Civil rights advocates condemned it. Journalists dissected it. The clip of Reeves declaring, "On this plane, this man is my boss," had already been looped thousands of times, morphing into a rallying cry. In Chicago, at Aero Global's corporate headquarters, the Crisis Command Center had activated. Screens glowed with graphs, live feeds, and streams of comments. Phones buzzed relentlessly. PR executives huddled around a large table, their voices sharp, urgent. "This is trending globally," one analyst reported, her eyes wide. CNN just picked it up. The BBC, too. "We're hemorrhaging brand equity by the minute." The head of corporate communications, Marjorie Kane, adjusted her glasses and spoke into a phone pressed to her ear. "We need a holding statement. Now. Acknowledge the incident. Commit to an investigation. Praise the captain's professionalism. Stay neutral. No admissions of guilt yet. But Karen Whitmore's name is already out there." Another executive interjected. "People are calling for her immediate firing. If we don't act, we'll look complicit." "Do not say her name." Kane snapped. "We cannot legally confirm anything until HR reviews. But yes, suspension pending investigation. Draft it now." In another corner, the CEO of Aero Global, Arthur Langford, had been pulled from a dinner with investors. His face was stone as he watched the viral clip on repeat. The more he saw the Carters' calm, Sandra's sneer, Reeves's thunderous rebuke, the more he understood the scale of the disaster. "Get me Reeves on the sat phone," he ordered, "and find out everything about these passengers. Carter, Dr. Carter, who is he?" Research staff scrambled. Within minutes, files were printed and passed along. Neurosurgeon, UCLA. National recognition, Amelia Carter. CEO of a luxury design firm. Respected, wealthy. Married 20 years. Not anonymous nobodies, but people with stature, resources, and voices that would carry. Langford's gut twisted. "We just picked the worst possible targets for this kind of mistake," he muttered. Back at 35,000 feet, dessert was served, petite pastries dusted with sugar, glossy with chocolate. Amelia pushed hers aside. Nathaniel tried to eat, but the sweetness turned bitter in his mouth. He leaned toward her, his tone contemplative. "Do you ever think about how easily these moments could break us? How a single person with too much power and too little sense can unravel everything we've built?" "All the time," Amelia admitted. "And that's why we hold steady. Because the minute we break, they win twice. Once for humiliating us, and again for stealing our peace." Her words settled into him like a balm, though the ache remained. Behind them, Ethan refreshed his feed again. The video had crossed 2 million views. He glanced toward the Carters, debating whether to tell them. Would it feel like validation or another theft of privacy? In the end, he said nothing. Some truths would arrive whether they were ready or not. Down on the ground, networks began cueing guests for the morning shows. Commentators framed it as a turning point, the dignity of a black couple, the arrogance of a gatekeeper, the rare intervention of someone with power who chose to use it rightly. Aero Global's stock price trembled after hours, sliding under the weight of public outrage. On the plane, the Carters leaned toward each other, their voices low, threading intimacy through the wreckage. Amelia's head rested lightly on Nathaniel's shoulder. "One day," she murmured, "we'll tell our children about this, not as a story of humiliation, but as a story of survival, of grace." Nathaniel kissed the crown of her head, and maybe, by then, the world will have changed enough that they won't need to understand it so deeply. The cabin lights dimmed, the soft glow signaling rest. Passengers adjusted blankets, reclined their seats. But in row 2, sleep felt impossible. Vindication had been won, yet unease lingered, pressing into their bones. Nathaniel closed his eyes, his mind circling the same thought: justice by coincidence is no justice at all. The wheels kissed the runway with a soft thud, the kind that only a seasoned captain could deliver. The cabin, still hushed from the long transatlantic crossing, stirred with the familiar symphony of landing seatbacks clicking upright. Overhead, bins latching, passengers craning toward the windows for the first glimpse of Italian soil. For Nathaniel and Amelia Carter, the arrival was surreal. They had crossed an ocean, but the turbulence they carried wasn't from the sky. The memory of the gate, Sandra Whitmore's sneer, Captain Reeves's thunderous defense, all of it lingered like static in the air between them. As the plane taxied toward the terminal, Amelia reached for Nathaniel's hand once again. It had become their anchor, the wordless thread that tethered them through chaos. He squeezed back, neither smiling nor frowning, simply acknowledging that they had survived another trial. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reeves's voice came over the intercom, calm and warm. "Welcome to Florence. Local time is 9:14 a.m. Weather clear, 72 degrees. It has been my honor to have you aboard this flight. On behalf of Aero Global, thank you for choosing us." His words carried more weight than the usual pilot script. They were both professional and personal, an echo of the promise he had made hours earlier: dignity, respect, decency. When the aircraft door opened, the usual shuffle toward the exit began. But this time, something different awaited. Standing at the end of the jet bridge was a man in a tailored Navy suit, holding a placard that read, "Carter." His posture was formal, his expression solemn, as though he were greeting dignitaries rather than passengers. "Dr. and Mrs. Carter," he asked in lightly accented English. "I am Marco Santini, station manager for Aero Global Florence. I am here on behalf of our CEO and the airline to express our deepest apologies." Nathaniel's shoulders stiffened. Amelia's eyes narrowed slightly. The script was predictable, the choreography clear. Corporate damage control had arrived on cue. Marco continued, his voice measured. "Please, this way. We have arranged expedited customs, private baggage handling, and transport to your hotel." He gestured toward a discreet side corridor. Other passengers turned their heads, watching as the Carters were guided away. Some looked confused, others curious, a few even envious. None of them knew the full weight of why. The corridor led to a private customs channel, manned by officials who waved them through with barely a glance. Their luggage appeared almost magically, already tagged and waiting. A black Mercedes sedan idled outside, its driver standing by with crisp efficiency. Inside the car, a sealed envelope sat on the seat. Amelia picked it up, her manicured nails slicing through the paper. She unfolded the letter inside, its thick cardstock embossed with Aero Global's crest. The words were carefully crafted acknowledgment of an unfortunate incident. Deep regret for the distress caused. A full refund of your fare. 200,000 bonus miles. And, most strikingly, a personal commendation to Captain Daniel Reeves for his extraordinary professionalism. Amelia read silently, her lips pressed into a thin line. She passed it to Nathaniel, who skimmed it, then let it fall onto his lap. Neither spoke for several minutes as the car glided smoothly through Florence's cobbled streets. Finally, Nathaniel exhaled. "It's polished. It's sincere on the surface, but it's not for us. It's for them, for their reputation." Amelia nodded, damage control dressed as contrition. She leaned her head back against the seat. The real apology already happened, on that plane, from the one man who didn't need a memo to know right from wrong. Nathaniel reached for her hand again. "Reeves, Yes, she murmured. Reeves. As they approached the hotel, a Renaissance palazzo turned five-star sanctuary, they were greeted not just by staff, but by Marco once more, standing stiffly at the entrance. He extended another apology, then disappeared as quickly as he had arrived, leaving the Carters to step into the cool marble lobby. In the privacy of their suite, overlooking the terracotta rooftops of Florence, Amelia finally allowed herself to exhale fully. She slipped off her heels, dropped her bag on the armchair, and stood at the window, gazing at the Duomo in the distance. "We made it," she whispered, half to herself. Nathaniel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "We did." But his voice carried the unspoken weight at what cost miles away, across the Atlantic. Sandra Whitmore's world was unraveling. She had been escorted off duty immediately after the flight, her badge deactivated, her access suspended. At first, she told herself it was temporary, a misunderstanding. HR would sort it out. She had served 22 years with the airline. One incident couldn't erase that. But when she returned home, her phone buzzed nonstop. Messages flooded in, some from colleagues, curt and evasive, others from strangers, venomous and cruel. Her name was plastered across social media, her face frozen in an unflattering still from Ethan's viral video. The caption beneath the clip had been retweeted 100,000 times. Aero Global attendant humiliates black couple captain, shuts her down. Sandra scrolled through the comments, her pulse quickening. Words like racist, monster, fire her filled the screen. Her email inbox groaned under the weight of angry demands. Even her daughter had texted, "Terrified, Mom. Kids at school are saying stuff." "What did you do?" She slammed the phone down, her chest heaving. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had followed the rules, or so she told herself, but deep down, in the quiet, she couldn't silence. Sandra knew the truth. She hadn't followed a rule. She had followed an instinct, a prejudiced, ugly instinct. And now the world was watching. Meanwhile, at Aero Global headquarters, the executive's calculus was shifting by the hour. Suspension was no longer enough. The calls for accountability were too loud, the damage too severe. By the time the Carters checked into their suite, an internal memo was already drafted: Sandra Whitmore's termination, effective immediately, citing gross misconduct and violation of the airline's code of conduct. Thomas Blake's name was included too, for failure to de-escalate and poor judgment. Back in Florence, Nathaniel and Amelia finally sat together on the edge of their bed, exhaustion pulling at them. Outside, the city bustled, oblivious to the storm that had carried them here. Amelia rested her head against Nathaniel's shoulder. "Do you feel better?" she asked softly. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "No. I feel unsettled, because justice came from a coincidence, not a system designed to protect us." If Reeves hadn't been our pilot, Amelia placed a finger gently on his lips. But he was, and we are here. We can breathe, at least for tonight. Nathaniel closed his eyes, pulling her closer. For tonight, outside their window, the bells of Florence tolled, ancient and resonant. Inside, the Carters sat in silence, knowing their story was no longer just their own. Florence glowed in the morning sun, its domes and towers casting long, honeyed shadows over the cobblestone streets. The Carters stepped out of their hotel into the rhythm of a city that had withstood centuries of beauty and conflict. Horse-drawn carriages clattered along piazzas, tourists clustered near the Duomo, and the aroma of espresso drifted from every cafe. For a moment, Nathaniel and Amelia allowed themselves to forget. They were two travelers, 20 years into a marriage built on perseverance and love, here to celebrate a milestone. They held hands as they walked through narrow alleys, the sound of church bells rolling across the rooftops. But Florence, for all its charm, could not insulate them from the storm trailing just a step behind. At the Uffizi Gallery, while standing before Botticelli's Birth of Venus, Amelia felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see a young woman, American by her accent, her phone clutched nervously. "Excuse me," the woman said softly. Are you the Carters from the video?" Amelia's stomach tightened. She forced a polite smile. "Yes, we are." The woman's eyes filled with admiration. "I just wanted to say thank you. The way you handled yourself, it gave me courage. My parents went through something similar last year, but they didn't have anyone to defend them. You reminded me of them." Amelia nodded, touched, yet uneasy. "Thank you for saying that." The woman left quickly, embarrassed by her own boldness, but the encounter left a residue. Later, at a cafe overlooking the Arno, another stranger approached, this time a middle-aged man in a tweed jacket. He leaned over their table, lowering his voice as though sharing a secret. "Dr. Carter," he said with a slight European accent. "I saw the video. I'm a physician too, in Milan. What happened to you was shameful, but the grace you showed, it spoke louder than their prejudice." Nathaniel offered a small, weary smile. "I appreciate that, truly." When the man departed, Amelia sighed. "Even here, halfway across the world, we can't just be Nathaniel and Amelia. We've become symbols." Nathaniel stared into his untouched cappuccino. Symbols don't get to rest. That night, in their suite, they sat on the balcony as the city glittered beneath them. The day had been filled with beauty paintings, pasta, laughter, but also interruptions, each reminder pulling them back to the gate in Los Angeles. Amelia broke the silence. "It's strange. People mean well, but every time they thank us, I feel that moment all over again. Her face, her voice, that word discrepancy, as if we were frauds." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "The compliments are kind, but they don't erase the humiliation. They only underline it." He paused, then added, "Sometimes I wonder if dignity means carrying the scar where everyone can see it." Meanwhile, back in Atlanta, Sandra Whitmore's world was shrinking. The official letter arrived by courier. Termination. Effective immediately. Benefits ended. Company property to be returned. She sat at her kitchen table, the paper trembling in her hands. For 22 years, Aero Global had been her identity. The uniform, the badge, the authority at the gate, it had been her world. Now it was gone, reduced to a paragraph of legal text. Her phone buzzed endlessly with alerts she refused to open. On television, her name was spoken with disgust. Her neighbors whispered, her daughter, once proud to tell classmates her mother worked for an airline, now avoided eye contact. Sandra tried to rationalize. She told herself she had only followed procedure, that she hadn't meant to humiliate anyone. But deep down, when she replayed the video, she saw it. The smirk, the suspicion in her eyes, the way she had savored the authority, ignoring evidence, ignoring dignity. She saw herself clearly, and the image terrified her. She ventured out once, to the grocery store, 2 aisles in. She felt the stares. A woman whispered, not quietly enough, "That's her, the racist from the plane." Sandra abandoned her cart and fled. At night, sleep eluded her. She sat in the dark, scrolling through the hateful comments. Monster! Karen of the skies. Never let her near a gate again. She wanted to scream that they didn't know her, that she wasn't that person. But the video told a different story, one she couldn't rewrite. In Florence, the Carters tried to reclaim moments of joy. They dined by candlelight in a trattoria, the walls lined with faded photographs. They strolled across the Ponte Vecchio at sunset, the river glowing gold beneath their feet. They toasted to 20 years of marriage, their glasses clinking softly. Yet even in laughter, a shadow lingered. Nathaniel caught Amelia staring off into the distance, her brow furrowed. She confessed quietly, "I keep thinking about what would have happened if Reeves hadn't walked out. If he hadn't recognized you." Nathaniel squeezed her hand. "We'd be in row 37, and no one would know our story." Amelia's voice trembled. "That's what terrifies me. That so many others are in row 37 every day, humiliated in silence, with no one to defend them." The truth of her words hung heavy between them. The next morning, Nathaniel woke to a flurry of emails on his phone. Journalists, activists, even hospital colleagues. The video had surpassed 10 million views overnight. News anchors were calling it a watershed moment. Aero Global's CEO was scheduled for a press conference. Civil rights groups were demanding reform. He scrolled, his chest tightening. The world had turned their private humiliation into a public cause. Amelia stirred beside him, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong?" He handed her the phone. She read in silence, then placed it gently on the nightstand. Her voice was quiet, resolute. "Then we need to decide. Do we retreat into privacy, or do we use this moment?" Nathaniel looked at her, the morning light softening her features. "And if we choose the second, then we make sure it's not just about us," she said. "We make it about everyone who doesn't have a Captain Reeves." Nathaniel's gaze held hers. He saw not just his wife, but the strategist, the fighter, the woman who had built her own empire brick by brick. He nodded slowly. "Then that's what we'll do." Back in Atlanta, Sandra sat at her dining table, pen in hand, a blank sheet of paper before her. For days, she had resisted, but the shame had eroded her defenses. Words tumbled in her mind, excuses, denials, anger, but none of them felt right. She began to write, "Dear Dr. and Mrs. Carter." Her hand shook, the ink blotting slightly on the page. For the first time, she stripped the words of justification. No defenses, no protocol, only the raw truth of her prejudice and the ruin it had brought. Tears blurred the letters as she wrote. It was not redemption, not yet, but it was the first honest act in a life that had hidden behind rules and authority. In Florence. Nathaniel and Amelia stood on their balcony, watching the sunrise over the Tuscan hills. The city stirred awake beneath them. For the first time in days, Nathaniel felt something close to clarity. "This isn't just our story anymore," he said softly. Amelia slipped her arm around his waist. "No, it belongs to everyone who's ever been told they don't belong." The bells of Florence rang out, solemn and bright, echoing across the rooftops. The Carters stood together, knowing the next chapter would demand more of them than they had ever planned. The press conference was scheduled for 10 o'clock sharp in Chicago, Aero Global's headquarters. By 9:30, the lobby was swarming with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones angled toward the podium, satellite trucks idled outside, their antennas pointed skyward. Social media feeds buzzed with speculation. Would Aero Global accept responsibility? Would Whitmore be fired? Would the Carters speak publicly? Inside a sleek conference hall, Arthur Langford, CEO of Aero Global, adjusted his tie in the mirror. His eyes betrayed the exhaustion of sleepless nights. He had rehearsed his statement dozens of times, every word vetted by legal counsel, but nothing could soften the weight of the storm pressing down on the airline. At exactly 10, he stepped to the podium. The room quieted instantly. "Good morning," Langford began, his voice steady but grave. "I stand before you today not just as the leader of Aero Global Airlines, but as a man deeply troubled by the events that unfolded on Flight 714 from Los Angeles to Florence." The cameras clicked furiously. What happened to Dr. Nathaniel and Mrs. Amelia Carter was unacceptable. He continued, "They are valued passengers who deserved respect, dignity, and the seamless service every customer is promised. Instead, they were subjected to humiliation and suspicion, caused by the prejudiced actions of one of our employees and compounded by poor judgment at the supervisory level." Gasps rippled through the room. Executives rarely spoke with such bluntness. Langford pressed on, effective immediately. Ms. Sandra Whitmore and Mr. Thomas Blake are no longer employed by Aero Global. Their conduct does not reflect our values or our standards. We have also launched a comprehensive review of our training, policies, and bias protocols. Every employee, from gate staff to senior leadership, will undergo mandatory retraining. This is not cosmetic, this is systemic reform. Reporters' hands shot up, but Langford raised his palm to pause them. There is one more acknowledgement to make. Captain Daniel Reeves demonstrated extraordinary integrity and moral courage. By refusing to allow prejudice to dictate the fate of two passengers, he upheld not only the dignity of the Carters, but the values that should guide us all. He will be formally recognized by the airline, and I, personally, am proud to call him one of our own. The applause that followed was rare in a press conference, but it came tentative at first, then growing. Langford's tone softened as he concluded, "Finally, to Dr. and Mrs. Carter, on behalf of the entire company, I extend our deepest apologies. Words cannot erase what you endured, but we are committed to ensuring no passenger ever faces such indignity again." The questions began immediately shouted, relentless. Will Aero Global compensate the Carters? Will Reeves receive a promotion? Do you admit systemic racism exists in your airline? Langford's rehearsed answers flowed, but beneath the polish was a current of urgency. He knew the world was watching. In Florence, the Carters watched the live stream from their hotel suite. Amelia sat on the edge of the bed, her arms folded. Nathaniel stood near the window, his reflection merging with the Tuscan rooftops beyond. When Langford announced Whitmore's firing, Amelia let out a slow breath. There it is, the sacrifice offered to the mob. Nathaniel turned, his brow furrowed. "Do you think it's justice?" "No," she replied. "It's accountability. Justice would be a system that never allowed it in the first place." He nodded, the truth heavy in the air. The knock at their door startled them. Nathaniel opened it to find Marco Santini, the Florence station manager, holding a tablet. "Dr. Carter, Mrs. Carter," he said with deference. "The press is requesting a statement from you. I told them I would ask." Amelia exchanged a glance with Nathaniel. "No," she said firmly. "Not now. Not yet." Marco bowed slightly. Of course. He left them in peace. Nathaniel sat beside her, his shoulders slumping. "We can't hide forever. At some point, we'll need to decide what to say." Amelia touched his hand. "And when we do, it won't be for them. It'll be for us, and for everyone else who's ever been told they don't belong." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Sandra Whitmore sat at her kitchen table, the silence of her home pressing in. The television replayed Langford's press conference on every channel. She watched, numb, as her name was spoken in past tense. No longer employed. She had expected it, yet hearing it aloud sliced deeper than she imagined. 22 years erased in a single sentence. Her daughter had stopped speaking to her, embarrassed by the relentless bullying at school. Friends no longer returned calls. Even her church community kept its distance. She was radioactive, her name a curse whispered in disgust. On the table before her lay the letter she had been drafting for days. It was wrinkled, stained with coffee, rewritten so many times that the ink blurred in places. She picked it up again, reading the words through watery eyes. Dear Dr. and Miss Carter, there is nothing I can write that will undo the harm I caused. For months, I told myself I was just doing my job, but the truth is, harder I acted on prejudice I did not even fully see in myself. I humiliated you when I should have honored you as fellow human beings. I ruined not only your day but my own life. For that, I am deeply sorry. Her hands trembled. She had resisted writing the next sentence, but now, as the press dissected her downfall, she forced herself to finish. I cannot ask for forgiveness. I only hope that in time, you will believe I am trying to change. Not for my job, not for the world, but because for the first time, I see the ugliness in myself, and I cannot bear it. She folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and wrote their names. She did not know if she would ever send it, but the act of writing had cracked something inside her, the wall of denial that had kept her from seeing herself as she truly was. Back in Florence, the Carters walked along the Arno at dusk. The city shimmered in golden light, its bridges crowded with tourists. Yet even in the crowd, they felt eyes on them. Some eyes filled with admiration, others simply curious. They were no longer anonymous. Nathaniel stopped on the bridge, gazing at the water below. This isn't the life I wanted, Amelia. To be a symbol, to be someone's headline. She slipped her arm through his. Symbols don't choose themselves. The world chooses them. What matters is what you do with it. He looked at her, his heart swelling with both love and weariness. And what do we do? Her eyes softened, but her voice was steady. We build, we transform this into something that outlasts the scandal. Something that helps the next person standing at a gate with a ticket in hand and dignity on the line. Nathaniel nodded slowly. For the first time, the path ahead began to take shape, not just as survival, but as purpose. As the bells of Florence rang again, the Carters walked on, their figures silhouetted against the fading sun, carrying not just their own story, but the weight of many others yet untold. The Carters had spent nearly a week in Florence. Each day unfolded like a tapestry of beauty and unease, Renaissance art in the mornings, quiet dinners by candlelight at night, and, in between, the constant ripple of recognition. Wherever they went, someone whispered, someone stared, someone summoned the courage to approach them. At first, Nathaniel and Amelia endured it with politeness. But by the fifth day, the weight of being symbols rather than simply travelers began to carve into their spirits. That morning, over cappuccinos on the hotel terrace, Amelia set her cup down and said what both of them had been circling around. "We need to speak," she said. Nathaniel's eyes flicked to hers, weary but knowing. Publicly? Yes. Not for them, she gestured vaguely toward the news report still playing on the lobby television, but for us. To reclaim the narrative, to make it about more than humiliation. Nathaniel leaned back, folding his hands together. His mind replayed the gate scene in Los Angeles, Sandra's tight smile. Thomas Blake's indifferent dismissal, the hot flush of shame as strangers looked on. He had spent years in operating rooms saving lives, but in that moment, he had felt powerless, and the feeling still gnawed at him. What if speaking just makes us a spectacle, he asked. Amelia reached across the table, taking his hand. Then we make sure it doesn't. We choose where, we choose how, and we choose what we say. Not interviews with gossip shows, something that gives us space to talk about the deeper truth. Nathaniel considered her words. He remembered her resolve in the gate line, the fire in her eyes when she told Sandra to show the supposed discrepancy. Amelia had always been a strategist. He realized she wasn't just thinking about catharsis, she was thinking about legacy. Where he asked at last. Amelia's lips curved faintly. I've been in touch with NPR. Fresh air, a long-form conversation, not a soundbite. Respectful, human. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. Then that's it. We'll do it. Later that afternoon, as if fate were aligning itself with their decision, an envelope arrived at the hotel. It bore no official seal, no airline crest, just their names handwritten in shaky script. Amelia turned it over in her hands. Strange. Nathaniel slid his finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was a letter, scrawled in uneven ink. The salutation caught him off guard. Dear Dr. and Mrs. Carter, they read together in silence. There is nothing I can write that will undo the harm I caused you at the gate that day. For months, I told myself I was a victim of circumstance, that I was just following rules, but now I know I was the architect of my own downfall. When I looked at you, I didn't see two accomplished people celebrating 20 years of marriage. I saw a threat to my sense of order. I acted on prejudice I didn't even fully understand in myself. Your dignity in that moment will haunt me forever, because it stands in such stark contrast to my own ugliness. I lost my job, my reputation, my home. But the real loss is knowing I reduced you to a stereotype when I should have honored your humanity. I cannot ask for forgiveness. I only want you to know I am trying to become a better person. For the first time in my life, I see myself clearly. And it is because of you, Sandra Whitmore. When Amelia finished reading aloud, the room was thick with silence. She placed the letter on the table as if it might burn her fingers. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. She admits it. Yes, Amelia whispered, she admits it. But her tone carried no triumph. No vindication, only fatigue. Nathaniel rose and paced the room. He felt conflicting tides pulling at him, anger for what they endured, sorrow for the ruin of a woman's life, and a strange, reluctant compassion for the vulnerability spilled across the page. She wants to change, Amelia said quietly. Or she wants absolution, Nathaniel countered. Maybe both. Amelia sighed. Either way, it's not our responsibility to fix her. Our responsibility is to decide what we do next. That evening, as Florence's cathedral bells tolled, they sat on their balcony again. The city glowed beneath them, but their eyes were on the letter lying between their wine glasses. Do we respond? Amelia asked. Nathaniel shook his head. No. Redemption is hers to seek, not ours to grant. They fell into silence again, listening to the bells echo across the rooftops. A world away. Sandra folded her hands on her kitchen table, waiting. She had mailed the letter without expectation, but part of her still longed for a reply, a scrap of acknowledgement, a line of grace. But none came. The next morning, the Carters confirmed their interview with NPR. They agreed to fly back to the U.S. early, understanding that their story had already outgrown Florence. The flight home felt different than the one that brought them here. No champagne could soothe the tension in their shoulders. No flatbed seat could carry away the burden of becoming unwilling representatives of something larger than themselves. As the plane descended over the American coastline, Amelia turned to Nathaniel. Are you ready? He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with resolve. Yes. But I'm not speaking as a surgeon or even as a husband. I'm speaking as a man who wants the world to see what dignity looks like under pressure. The NPR studio in Philadelphia was understated compared to the swirling chaos of TV news. No flashing cameras, no clamoring reporters. Just a dimly lit room, microphones, and the calm presence of the host, a woman whose voice carried gentleness and steel in equal measure. Dr. and Mrs. Carter, she greeted them. Thank you for being here. I want to start not with what happened to you at the gate, but who you are beyond that. Tell us about your life before all this. For the first time, Nathaniel felt air fill his lungs without restriction. This wasn't an interrogation. It was a conversation. He spoke of his years in medicine, the lives he had touched, the quiet victories unseen by the world. Amelia spoke of building her design firm, of the challenges of being underestimated, of the pride she took in creating spaces of beauty. Only then did they circle back to Los Angeles International. Nathaniel's voice was steady as he recounted the humiliation, the disbelief, the temptation to erupt, and the decision to remain calm. Amelia described the silent strategies Black couples perfect over decades, the glance that says, "Stay steady," the practiced patience that masks rage. People see the video and they call us heroes, she said, her tone low. But what they don't see is the exhaustion. The decades of small slights and large humiliations that train you for a moment like that. We didn't want to be dignified in that line. We wanted to be boarding a plane to Florence, excited for our anniversary. Dignity was survival, not choice. The host leaned closer to the mic. And what do you want listeners to take away? Nathaniel paused, his eyes on Amelia. She nodded for him to speak. That this wasn't about us, he said firmly. We were lucky a coincidence saved us. But millions of others have no Captain Reeves waiting in the wings. They are turned away, disrespected, diminished, and no one records it. No one goes viral. What we want is a world where dignity isn't luck. It's guaranteed. When the interview ended, the host thanked them with genuine warmth. The Carters walked out of the studio into the crisp Philadelphia air, hand in hand. For the first time since that day at the gate, they felt lighter, not free, not healed, but purposeful. Back in Atlanta, Sandra sat at her small kitchen table, the radio playing faintly. She heard Nathaniel's voice, steady and strong, carrying across the airwaves. She heard Amelia's clarity, her demand for a world where dignity was not negotiable. Tears spilled down Sandra's cheeks. The letter she had written sat unopened on their end. She knew. But the voices on the radio reminded her that change wasn't in their reply. It was in her own choices from here forward. She closed her eyes and whispered to the silence. Thank you for showing me who I really was, and who I need to become. For the Carters, the choice to speak had become the choice to lead. The weeks following the Carters' NPR interview unfolded like waves, one cresting after another. What began as a viral video had transformed into a full-fledged national conversation. Editorials debated systemic bias in air travel. Activists cited the Carters as proof that everyday prejudice could no longer be hidden. Airline executives across the industry scrambled to issue statements and revise training protocols. Nathaniel and Amelia, who had once only wanted an anniversary trip to Florence, now found themselves at the center of a cultural reckoning. At first, they tried to retreat back into normalcy. Nathaniel returned to the hospital, scrubbing in for surgeries, steadying his hands as lives lay before him. Amelia reopened her design studio, guiding clients through swatches of fabric and palettes of color. But the calls kept coming. Invitations to panels, requests for op-eds, awards they never sought. One evening, as they sat on their porch in Atlanta, watching fireflies flicker across the garden, Amelia spoke the truth neither of them had voiced aloud. "We can't just go back," she said softly. "We've been given a platform. As exhausting as it is, we owe it to use it." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, the memory of the gate agent's suspicion still alive in his chest. "And what do we build with it?" Amelia's eyes lit with the same determination she had shown when suggesting NPR. "A scholarship. Something lasting. Not just for students with perfect grades, but for those who've carried the same weight we carried at that gate, those who've had to fight twice as hard to be believed." Nathaniel nodded slowly, pride swelling in him. Together, they began drafting the framework for what would become the Carter Reeves Scholarship Fund, honoring not only their own resilience, but also Captain Daniel Reeves' courage to intervene. Meanwhile, Sandra Whitmore's world continued to collapse. The job applications she submitted returned silence. Her former colleagues avoided her calls. Even grocery shopping required sunglasses and a ball cap to avoid recognition. But the silence after the NPR interview lingered differently. She replayed their voices over and over, haunting and instructive. Amelia's insistence that dignity was survival. Nathaniel's call for a world where it wasn't luck. Each sentence felt like a mirror, forcing her to confront not what she had lost, but what she had been complicit in. Late one night, Sandra packed her belongings into cardboard boxes. She was moving to a smaller apartment in Oregon, far from Atlanta, far from whispers. As she taped the final box shut, she found herself whispering a promise to no one in particular. "I will not be that woman again." Her letter to the Carters remained unanswered, but it had served its purpose. It was not their forgiveness she needed, it was her own transformation. For the first time, she sought counseling, joining a community program that addressed implicit bias and accountability. Sitting in a circle of strangers, admitting her failures, she began a painful journey inward. Back in Atlanta, the Carters officially launched their scholarship fund. The announcement took place at Morehouse College, before a crowd of students whose faces reflected hope, struggle, and resilience. Amelia stood at the podium, elegant in a navy dress, her voice carrying across the auditorium. "This fund is not born of tragedy," she said. "It is born of dignity. What happened to us was painful, humiliating, and wrong. But if our story can light even one path forward, then it cannot be wasted." Nathaniel followed, his tone quieter but just as powerful. "I spend my days in operating rooms fighting for the chance to give people life. But life is more than a heartbeat. It is dignity, opportunity, and the belief that you belong in every space you enter. That is what this fund will fight for." The applause shook the hall. Students surged forward afterward, some with tears in their eyes, thanking them not just for the money, but for the example. Outside, cameras captured the event. But for once, Nathaniel and Amelia didn't feel like spectacles. They felt like builders, planting something that would outlast them. That night, they sat together in their kitchen, the scholarship's first applications already pinging their inbox. Nathaniel closed his laptop and looked at Amelia. "Do you realize," he said softly, "this started with 2 boarding passes to Florence. We thought we were buying a vacation. Instead, we bought a fight we didn't know we'd have to lead." Amelia smiled faintly, her hand finding his, "And we're still leading it. Together." Months later, an envelope arrived in their mailbox. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside was a simple postcard, an image of the Oregon coast, waves crashing against black rock. On the back, in careful script, it read, "I don't expect you to remember me, but I remember you. I am working to change. Thank you for showing me what dignity looks like." It was unsigned, but they knew. Amelia held the postcard in silence, then set it gently on the mantel. Neither forgiveness nor condemnation passed their lips. Only the acknowledgement that even broken paths could lead to new roads. Years would pass, and the story of Flight 714 would become part of a larger narrative, a case study in classrooms, a talking point in boardrooms, an anecdote told in diversity workshops. But for Nathaniel and Amelia, it would never be about viral fame or corporate statements. It would always be about the quiet choice they made at a gate in Los Angeles to hold their dignity when someone tried to strip it away. On a warm summer night, they sat once more on their porch, fireflies drifting lazily through the garden. Nathaniel leaned toward Amelia, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever wish we'd just boarded without trouble, had our champagne, and forgotten it all?" Amelia thought for a long moment before answering, "No, because then we wouldn't have built this, and the world would still be the same." Nathaniel kissed her hand gently, the fireflies glowing around them like tiny lanterns. Their journey had begun with humiliation, but it ended with hope. Hope etched not in headlines, but in the lives of young people who would rise because of the scholarship. Hope in a world nudged, however slightly, toward fairness. The story of Nathaniel and Amelia Carter was not about being victims. It was about resilience, grace, and the refusal to let prejudice define them. It was about turning pain into legacy. And as long as their voices carried, whether in lecture halls or whispered in a student's gratitude, the lesson would endure. Dignity is not granted by others. It is claimed, guarded, and used to change the weather of the world. What began as 2 boarding passes became a reckoning. Nathaniel and Amelia Carter endured humiliation, but they answered it not with rage, not with revenge, but with dignity and purpose. They transformed pain into legacy, turning their story into a scholarship fund that will lift others for generations. Sandra Whitmore lost her job, her reputation, and her place in the world. But even in her fall, there was a glimmer of something deeper, a painful recognition of prejudice and the long, lonely road toward change. This story leaves us with questions we cannot ignore. How many others face the same suspicion without a Captain Reeves to intervene? How many stories never go viral, never spark outrage, never find justice? And in those moments, who are we, silent bystanders or voices of courage? The Carters remind us that dignity is not just about surviving prejudice. It is about reshaping the world so that dignity is never negotiable again. Their journey forces us to reflect, to feel, and to act. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge injustice and celebrate resilience. Stay with us. The next story may be the one that changes everything.